I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would spend her evenings replaying old conversations in her head, analyzing every pause, every choice of word, until the meaning I once thought was clear became slippery and strange. But that's what grief does, it gnaws at you until you start questioning your own memories. My name is Lila, and I'm 56 years old. If you had met me a few years ago, you would have seen a woman who still laughed easily, who carried her mother's recipes in her mind, like treasured jewels, who thought the bond between a mother and daughter was sacred, unshakable, and eternal. But everything I believed in was shattered the day my mother's will was read. I grew up in a quiet town in Pennsylvania, the youngest of 3 children. My brother Alan was the firstborn, tall, steady, and practical like my father. My sister Ruth came 2 years later, full of charm and ambition, with a sharp tongue that could cut and a smile that could heal. And then there was me arriving 10 years after Ruth, almost like an afterthought. By the time I came along, my parents were older, more tired, and my siblings already had their roles carved out. I was the little one, the shadow, the one who listened while others spoke. But my mother, Marianne, made me feel like I was chosen. She would hold my face in her hands and whisper, "You're my miracle, Lila. My late blessing." Those words carried me through childhood like a warm coat against winter. My father died when I was 22, suddenly a heart attack that left us all gasping like fish out of water. But my mother was iron beneath her soft exterior. She kept the house running, paid off debts, and stood straight even when her hands trembled. It was during those years after his death that she and I grew closest. Alan had already moved across the country for work, and Ruth was in and out of marriages, chasing dreams and breaking hearts. I stayed. I stayed because I felt I owed her, but also because I wanted to. She became not just my mother, but my confidant, my friend, my anchor. So when at 78 she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, there was no hesitation. I moved into her house, the one filled with creaking floorboards and the scent of lavender polish she used on the old oak furniture. I cooked her meals, scheduled her doctor's visits, sat by her hospital bed through endless nights when morphine blurred her words. I brushed her hair when she was too weak to lift her arm. I sang the lullabies she once sang to me when the pain kept her awake. Every choice I made during those 3 years of her illness was rooted in love, not duty. She was my mother. She was my everything. But the strange thing about sickness is that it doesn't just break down the body. It reveals truths you never saw before. Sometimes it's the way a sibling avoids visiting because they can't stand hospitals when what they mean is they can't handle inconvenience. Sometimes it's the way neighbors stop by only when they want to be seen, not when help is really needed. And sometimes it's the way a mother's eyes flicker when a certain name is mentioned, a shadow passing so quickly you almost convince yourself you imagined it. Ruth showed up occasionally dressed as if she were stepping onto a stage with expensive perfume trailing her like smoke. She'd sit at Mom's bedside for 20 minutes scrolling her phone, then leave with tears that looked rehearsed. Alan came even less, sending checks from Seattle instead of his presence. And I was there through every minute, watching my mother shrink into a fragile shell, yet clinging to every word she whispered, every story she chose to retell. One night near the end, she gripped my hand and said, "You're my heart, Lila. Don't ever forget that." Tears blurred my vision as I promised I wouldn't. I thought those words meant something permanent, something unshakable. She passed on, a quiet Sunday morning sunlight spilling through lace curtains onto her bedspread. I remember holding her hand until it grew cold, my tears soaking the sheets, feeling like the world had tilted and I'd never find balance again. The days after were a blur of arrangements, condolences casseroles left at the door. Ruth cried the loudest at the funeral, clutching Alan's arm like a child, while I stood still, a stone surrounded by waves. Weeks later, when the lawyer summoned us to his office for the reading of the will, I wasn't anxious. I wasn't thinking about money or property. My mother's estate was modest, a small house, some savings, a few heirlooms. What mattered was the symbolism. I believed after everything, after the nights I spent wiping her brow, and the mornings I coaxed her to eat, she would leave something that said, "I see you. I value you. You were my miracle." The lawyer's office smelled of stale coffee and paper. We sat around a polished mahogany table, Alan calm, Ruth restless, me, clutching a tissue, though I hadn't yet cried. The lawyer, a thin man with glasses perched on his nose, cleared his throat and began reading. To my son Alan, I leave the house on Willow Street where I raised my children in gratitude for his stability and responsibility. To my daughter Ruth, I leave my jewelry collection passed down from my mother and grandmother in recognition of her spirit and style. And then came silence. I waited, leaning forward, my heart pounding. The lawyer shuffled papers. Ruth dabbed her eyes dramatically. Alan adjusted his tie. I broke the silence. And me? My voice sounded small, like a child's. The lawyer looked at me with pity that sliced me open. There's no mention of you, Miss Carter. No mention. The words rang in my ears like a bell that wouldn't stop. I shook my head, certain there was a mistake. That can't be right. She told me I was with her. My voice cracked, dissolved into nothing. Ruth glanced at me with something almost like triumph in her eyes, while Alan muttered awkwardly about maybe there being an error. But the truth lay on those papers, in black and white. My mother had left me nothing. Not the house where I nursed her. Not the jewelry she once let me try on as a little girl. Not even a keepsake. Nothing. I stumbled out of that office numb, the world spinning. How could she? After all I had done, all the love I had poured into her final years. How could she erase me from her legacy? Hadn't she called me her heart? Hadn't she said I was her miracle? For weeks I lived in a fog of disbelief. I boxed up my belongings from her house, each item feeling like a wound. I packed my books, my clothes, my mother's scent still lingering in the curtains. Ruth hovered like a vulture already planning renovations, while Alan kept his distance. I slept in a cheap motel for a while, staring at the ceiling, replaying her last words over and over, until they twisted into knives. Grief turned into anger. Anger turned into obsession. I needed to know why. I needed to understand what had poisoned her mind against me. I dug through old letters, journals, boxes of photographs. I stayed up until dawn, piecing together fragments of a puzzle I didn't know existed. And slowly, a different picture emerged. There were letters addressed to a man whose name I didn't recognize, tucked away in a locked tin I found at the back of her closet. The handwriting was my mother's, younger and bolder, full of yearning. Words of love, of longing, of regret. The dates on those letters overlapped with my childhood. And then, in one envelope, a sentence that stopped my breath. I wish Lila could know the truth about her father one day, but I fear it would break her. The room spun as I clutched the letter. My father, the man who raised me, who I buried when I was 22, might not have been my biological father at all. The pieces clicked together, the distance between me and my siblings, the whispers at family gatherings. I never quite caught the way my mother's eyes sometimes flickered with shadows. I wasn't erased from the will out of forgetfulness or cruelty. I was erased because I was a secret, a reminder of something she had tried to bury. The betrayal sank deep into my bones, colder than any grave. Not only had she left me with nothing material, but she had left me without the truth, forcing me to stumble upon it like broken glass. I felt like I had been living someone else's life, believing in a bond that was tainted from the beginning. And yet beneath the rage and devastation, a darker resolve began to grow. If my mother had thought she could silence me with omission, if my siblings believed they could push me aside and enjoy the spoils of her estate, they were wrong. I would uncover everything. I would make sure the truth they wanted hidden would rise like smoke they couldn't choke down. And I would take back the power they thought they stripped from me. Because love had bound me to my mother, but betrayal had set me free. I started with the letters, rereading them until the words etched themselves into my skin. They weren't just love notes, they were evidence, a map pointing me toward a man who might still be alive, a man who was tied to me by blood, even if he was a stranger. His name was Samuel. The first letters were full of passion, signed with longing, but as the years went on, they turned desperate. He wrote of wanting to see me, of wanting to be part of my life, but my mother's responses shut him out. She wrote of protecting her marriage, of sparing me confusion, of keeping appearances. Protecting, sparing, keeping. Words that now felt like knives in my back. I couldn't shake the thought, did my mother truly love me? Or was I just a burden she carried, a mistake she tried to cover with pretty words like miracle? Every time I remembered her hand in mine, her whispered, "You're my heart," I felt sick. How much of it had been guilt instead of love? I tracked Samuel down. It wasn't easy. He wasn't on social media, and the address on the old letters belonged to a building that had long since been torn down. But the county records office became my second home. I combed through birth certificates, land deeds, archived newspapers, until finally I found a trace of Samuel Whitaker still living 79 years old, only 3 hours away in Scranton. I drove there on a rainy Tuesday, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. My motel room had become suffocating, the walls pressing in on me, and I needed answers that no one else would give. His house was modest, with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox. I stood on the porch for several minutes before knocking my breath, fogging in the cold. When the door opened, I saw a man with thinning white hair and eyes the color of slate. Eyes that mirrored mine. The shock on his face was immediate, followed by something else, recognition. "Lila," he whispered, as though he had always been waiting. The world tilted. My knees almost gave out, but I steadied myself on the doorframe. "So it's true," I said, though my voice cracked. "You're my father." He nodded slowly, tears already gathering. "Your mother? She wouldn't let me see you. I wrote I begged, but she said it was best. I tried, Lila, I tried." The rest of that evening unraveled like a hidden reel of film. He told me about their affair, how it had begun in grief, when my father worked long hours and my mother was lonely. He admitted he loved her truly, loved her, but she refused to leave her marriage. When I was born, she cut him off to protect her reputation. He had lived with the ache ever since. I should have felt rage, and I did. But there was also something else, grief for what I had never known. An entire childhood where I might have had another father to lean on, another set of arms to comfort me. Instead, I had been a secret erased even in death. Samuel asked me to come back to visit to let him make up for lost time, but I couldn't. Not then. My heart was too raw, too full of questions that had no satisfying answers. I drove back in silence, the rain streaking the windshield like tears I couldn't cry. Meanwhile, Ruth wasted no time moving into the house. She sent me smug texts about redecorating, about how Mom would have wanted this. Alan, ever the peacekeeper, urged me to let things go, to focus on healing. But I couldn't let it go. Because it wasn't just about the will. It was about my identity, about being erased, about the years I had given up only to be discarded, like I had never mattered. So I began to plan. I wasn't reckless. I didn't shout or threaten. Instead, I gathered. I collected the letters. I requested official DNA testing with Samuel, just in case I needed proof. I consulted a lawyer of my own who explained that wills were powerful, but they weren't always ironclad, especially not if undue influence or hidden assets came into play. One evening, when Ruth hosted a gathering in the house that had once been my sanctuary, I drove by slowly watching the lights flicker through the curtains. Laughter floated into the night. My laughter, my memories, my sacrifices all being swallowed by her greed. That's when I promised myself they would not win. Not like this. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. While sorting through some of my mother's medical paperwork, I found a discrepancy in her financial records. A bank account I didn't recognize with transactions that didn't align with her modest lifestyle. Quietly, I followed the trail, and what I discovered nearly took my breath away. She had been hiding money, a lot of it. Investments she had never spoken of tucked away in trust funds and obscure accounts. The total added up to nearly $500,000. None of it was mentioned in the will. I brought this to my lawyer, and his eyes lit up. If this wasn't disclosed in probate, you have grounds to challenge. And if there was any coercion, any chance your siblings influenced her while she was sick, he didn't need to finish. I already knew what I had to do. Filing the challenge was like setting fire to a dry field. Ruth called me a snake, accusing me of trying to rob her. Alan tried to mediate, but even he was shaken by the hidden accounts. The lawyer meetings grew tense, the courtroom dates loomed. Every time I walked into that sterile courthouse, I felt my mother's ghost pressing down on me. I wanted to scream at her to ask why she had forced me into this battle. But I didn't scream. I built my case carefully. I presented the letters, the DNA evidence, the financial discrepancies. I told the court about the care I had given, the sacrifices I made, the blatant exclusion that had no reasonable explanation. Each word I spoke was soaked in pain, but also in resolve. I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for acknowledgement, for the truth. The climax came on a stormy afternoon when Ruth, under oath, let her mask slip. Pressed by questions, she admitted that she had discussed the will with Mom while she was heavily medicated, that she had suggested fairness meant dividing everything between her and Alan. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the judge's eyes narrowing. My chest swelled with both fury and vindication. The ruling didn't give me everything. The will was still valid in parts, but the hidden assets had to be divided equally. The court also recognized that undue influence had likely played a role, though it was too late to reverse all decisions. In the end, I received a share enough to regain stability, enough to prove I hadn't been forgotten entirely. But more than that, the truth was exposed. My siblings had to face it. The world now knew I wasn't invisible. When I walked out of that courthouse rain washing over my face, I felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but no longer erased. And yet, at night when the silence settles, I still hear my mother's voice. I still wonder if she truly loved me, or if I was only ever a wound she tried to bandage with sweet words. The scars will never fade completely. But I've learned something. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. Sometimes it's about reclaiming the space you were denied, forcing the world to say your name out loud when others try to erase it. After the court battle, life didn't return to normal, because there was no normal left for me. The house on Willow Street, the one I had once walked through with trays of soup for my mother, now belonged to Ruth. I couldn't bear to step inside again, not when the walls carried the echo of my laughter, but now stood as a monument to betrayal. My share of the hidden assets was enough to rent a modest apartment across town. It was small, with creaky plumbing and thin walls, but it was mine, untouched by ghosts. The first night I slept there, I lay awake, listening to my neighbor's dog barking the hum of traffic outside. For the first time in years, I didn't hear my mother's uneven breathing or the clatter of Ruth's heels on the floorboards. It was silence I had earned, though it felt heavy, weighted with everything I had lost. Ruth, of course, paraded her victory. She redecorated the house, replacing my mother's floral curtains with sleek blinds, painting the walls stark white as if to scrub out any trace of what had come before. Photos on social media showed her hosting gatherings, wine glasses clinking, her laughter shining like a weapon. Alan remained distant, torn between keeping the peace and carrying his own shame for how things unfolded. He called me occasionally, his voice careful, like stepping over broken glass. I answered, but I no longer trusted the bond we once had. Yet something inside me refused to stay buried under grief. Perhaps it was the blood I shared with Samuel, the proof that my life had never been what I thought, that gave me a strange new strength. I began meeting him quietly, cautiously at first. We walked in parks, sat at diners over steaming coffee, exchanged fragments of years we had missed. He asked about my childhood, my dreams, my scars, and for the first time, I allowed myself to speak of the loneliness of the ways I had felt set apart, even before I knew why. He cried sometimes openly, apologizing for what he couldn't change. I realized then that I didn't need him to fix the past. I just needed someone to acknowledge it, to say out loud that I mattered. He gave me that. Slowly, I found myself forgiving him, not for the affair, not for the years of absence, but for being human, for wanting love, for wanting me even when he couldn't have me. Meanwhile, I found a strange sense of purpose in telling my story. Not publicly at first. I kept journals, filling page after page with the rawest confessions of my heart. The words bled out of me heavy and unfiltered. Every sentence felt like wringing poison from my veins. Some nights I read aloud what I had written, as if speaking into the void might carry my pain somewhere beyond myself. It was during one of those nights, staring at the dim glow of my lamp, that I realized revenge wasn't always loud. It didn't always have to be a courtroom battle or a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes revenge was quiet survival, refusing to vanish, even when someone tried to erase you. Sometimes it was living, breathing, thriving when they expected you to crumble. But fate has a way of stirring the pot just when you think it's done boiling. A year after the will's reading, Ruth threw a lavish party at the house to mark the anniversary of Mom's passing. I wasn't invited, of course, but whispers travel fast in small towns. Friends told me of her speeches dripping with false sentiment, painting herself as the dutiful daughter who had borne the weight of everything. My blood boiled as I heard it, my hands shaking around the mug I held. That night, I made a choice. I gathered the letters again, the DNA results, the proof of Samuel's existence and connection to me. I wrote a careful statement, not vengeful, but truthful, laying out what had been hidden for decades. And then, with trembling fingers, I mailed copies to the local newspaper, to extended family, to anyone who still believed Ruth's polished lies. When the story broke, it was like a lightning strike in our community. My mother's secret affair, the child she bore out of wedlock, the daughter she excluded in death, it all spread like wildfire. People whispered in grocery stores, neighbors exchanged glances. Ruth was furious, calling me vindictive, heartless. Alan stayed silent, perhaps knowing the truth was too heavy to fight anymore. But I didn't do it for them. I did it for me. For the little girl who had once sat at her mother's knee, believing she was special, believing she was loved without condition. That girl deserved the truth, no matter how messy, no matter how shameful. And though the fallout was messy, relationships, fractured reputations, tarnished, I felt strangely calm. For the first time, I wasn't carrying someone else's secret. I wasn't living half a life in the shadow of lies. I was simply Lila broken, but unhidden. In the months that followed, Samuel's health began to decline. I found myself by his side in hospital rooms, holding his hand, as monitors beeped steadily. The roles reversed. I became the caretaker again, but this time without the sting of erasure. He looked at me with love, with pride, and when he called me his daughter, the ache inside me softened. When he passed, I grieved not just the man he was, but the years I never had with him. Yet I also carried a strange gratitude that at least in the end, I had known him, that he had named me, claimed me, and loved me in the open, even if briefly. Standing at his graveside, I felt a deep truth settle into my bones. Betrayal may shatter you, but it also frees you. It strips illusions, burns lies to ash, and leaves only what is real. And what was real for me was that I had survived. I had clawed my way through grief, through deception, through erasure, and come out scarred, but standing. Sometimes survival is the most powerful revenge of all. In the quiet after Samuel's death, I found myself sitting on my apartment balcony most nights, staring at the flickering streetlights and listening to the hum of passing cars. The grief was heavy, yes, but it wasn't the same kind of grief I had carried when my mother died. Losing Samuel was like losing something I never fully had, a wound that was more about absence than betrayal. It hurt, but it also gave me closure. His last words to me had been simple. You were always mine, even when I couldn't hold you. I carried that like a shield, something to protect me, when the memories of my mother threatened to unravel me. Meanwhile, the cracks in Ruth's polished facade began to widen. The fallout from my revelations in the paper hadn't disappeared. It lingered like smoke after a fire. Neighbors avoided her, family friends whispered, and her carefully curated image of being the perfect daughter began to rot from within. She still had the house, yes, but it was no longer a place of pride. It was a place people gossiped about. Every time she posted pictures online, comments trickled in, some supportive, others questioning, a few outright cruel. For a woman who thrived on appearances, it was its own form of punishment. Alan reached out again, his voice weary. He asked if we could meet for coffee, and after weeks of ignoring him, I agreed. We sat in a small cafe on the edge of town, the smell of cinnamon and espresso filling the air. He looked older than I remembered, lines etching his face, his once steady hands fidgeting with his cup. I'm sorry, Lila, he said at last. His voice cracked, and for a moment I saw the brother I had loved as a child, the one who once carried me on his shoulders and bought me ice cream when I scraped my knee. I should have done more. I should have fought for you, too. The words loosened something in me, but they didn't erase the years of silence the way he had stood back while Ruth sharpened her knives. It's too late for that, I whispered, though my heart ached even as I said it. But maybe not too late to start again. We talked for hours, not about the will or the court, but about our childhood. About Dad teaching us to ride bikes, about Mom's pot roast that was always too salty, about summers at the lake. Memories that still belonged to both of us, even if the truth had carved a canyon between us. By the end of it, I realized something. Forgiveness wasn't a gift I was giving him. It was a weight I was lifting from myself. Months passed, seasons changed, and I found myself slowly rebuilding a life that was mine alone, not tethered to my mother's choices or my siblings' greed. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. My apartment walls became a gallery of colors, angry reds, morning blues, fragile greens. Each canvas was a confession, a scream, a prayer. I didn't care if anyone else understood them. They were mine, honest and unhidden. But the true turning point came on the second anniversary of my mother's death. I hadn't planned to mark it in any special way, but that morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest. I walked to the cemetery with a single white lily in my hand. The air was crisp, the grass damp with dew. Standing at her grave, I expected to feel rage or maybe sorrow. Instead, I felt something quieter, weariness perhaps, but also release. I placed the lily down and whispered, "You hurt me. You broke me. But you also made me strong." My voice trembled, but I kept going. "I'll never understand why you chose what you did. I'll never stop wondering if you loved me the way you said you did. But I won't carry this weight forever. I refuse to let your silence define me." As the wind rustled the trees, I felt lighter, as though I had finally laid something down. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but freedom. In the years that followed, my story became something I chose to share, not just in journals, but with others. I joined a support group for people estranged from their families, and when I spoke, women leaned in their eyes, wet their hands gripping mine. They saw themselves in my story: forgotten daughters, erased siblings, betrayed caretakers. Together, we stitched a quilt of broken pieces, finding warmth in the knowledge that we were not alone. One evening after a meeting, a woman said to me, "You turned your pain into a voice. That's the kind of revenge no one can take away." Her words stayed with me, a mantra I repeated whenever doubt clawed at me. As for Ruth, she never forgave me. She still lives in the house, but I no longer see it as mine. It's just a building with walls that remember too much. Alan, though he calls me every Sunday now. Sometimes it's just to chat about the weather. Sometimes it's to reminisce. Sometimes it's to apologize all over again. I let him. Because rebuilding doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing what pieces are worth carrying forward. Looking back now, I realize my mother's betrayal didn't just break me. It forced me to rebuild myself from the ground up. And in doing so, I became someone she could never erase. Someone stronger, someone fiercer, someone who refuses to vanish into silence. So yes, I was by her side when she was sick. I gave her everything only to be left with nothing. But in losing everything she denied me, I found something greater myself. And if you've made it this far, listening to the mess of my heart, I want to leave you with this: betrayal can feel like the end, but sometimes it's just the beginning. Sometimes it's the push that forces you to step into your own power. Don't let anyone's silence erase you. Speak, claim your story, live it loudly. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your own stories, the truths you've carried. Together, we can turn silence into something stronger.